Coming up on Chopper's political podcast, but Farage just seems like a decent guy that you could imagine having a drink with, and I think that partly explains why he has done so well. Yeah, absolutely.
Welcome back to Chopper's political podcast, where I bring you the best guest gossip, news and stories from our studios here at GB News in the heart of Westminster. My name is Christopher Hope. I'm GB News' political editor. Is Reform a one-man band? And is that a problem? And what does the Senate by-election result in Caerphilly last week mean for the May elections? We're speaking later to James Frayne, the former Tory strategist who is well connected in Tory circles. But first, as civil servants tend to be dragged more and more into the public eye in recent years, I'll be joined shortly by Dave Penman. He is the General Secretary of the First Division Association, the FDA, the union which represents senior civil servants. It got me to wondering, why is there so much attention on civil servants? Should they be seen and not heard, perhaps? Or should they be more in the public eye? Is it right we're getting more out of these civil servants and holding them more to account on the public stage? Is it fair? Dave Penman, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. You run the First Division Association, the FDA, which looks after the interests of senior civil servants, of course. You've been watching what's been going on in Parliament recently with this China spy case. Are you comfortable with the way that Matthew Collins, the Deputy National Security Advisor, was treated? I mean, he was called in front of MPs, wasn't he? Shouldn't that be a job for elected MPs rather than officials who are often quite limited to what they can say?
Yeah, I mean, it's never comfortable for a civil servant who finds themselves in the kind of glare of publicity. And I think there are times when the nature of the role means that's appropriate, and there are times when it's not. I think it was quite difficult the way his name came out and the way government, what I think they were trying to do was explain that this wasn't kind of political involvement. This was the Deputy National Security Advisor doing his kind of official job in relation to the evidence that he gave. But it looked like, I think, for a period of time, like he was getting thrown under the bus a little bit, which obviously we've seen in the past a number of politicians doing. I don't think that's probably what they were intending to do. And I think the difficulty is there are some roles in the civil service where inevitably you are in the public eye, that the decisions that you take are subject to scrutiny, the advice you give. It can be quite difficult for civil servants to deal with this because they're quite often advising ministers, and ministers are actually making the decisions.
Yeah.
And that's how we would normally work in terms of policy. It's a bit more complicated when it comes to issues around national security and particularly on this issue around giving evidence. But it was, I think for a few days, it was quite uncomfortable. But I think we've got to a point where there's a recognition of he was doing his job and he was interpreting the evidence he's got. And it didn't really feel, I think, at the end that the intention was to kind of throw him under a bus. And
lots of people spoke out about him, and I think talked him up really, and made clear that he was just doing his job. And yet that goes to the central point, doesn't it? Do you think that politicians are often blaming the civil service for their failings? They rail against the blob. They're currently attacking Chris Wormold, of course, who's the Cabinet Secretary. Is it unfair? I mean, are your members being unfairly blamed for their failings?
So I think that civil servants have to be accountable for their performance and what they do. That's only right. They're paid by the taxpayer. They're there to deliver for the elected government of the day and the taxpayers in delivering public services. I think the difficulty with the civil service is a civil servant, whoever it is, cannot answer back publicly. So holding a civil servant to account is what ministers should do and should do well. But that has to be in private, because if we're going to end up in a slanging match against civil servants or briefings and anonymous briefings, they don't have an ability to defend themselves. They can't actually speak out. And we've had situations where we have had some senior civil servants who have been attacked in the press, essentially at the behest of special advisors from ministers, and they've had to go to the same special advisors who are actually briefing the press to get permission to be able to defend themselves. So it's kind of an example of how ludicrous it is. So it's not that civil servants can't and shouldn't be accountable is that that's not something that should be done in the kind of public domain, unless you want to take the shackles off and have a kind of public slanging match between civil servants and ministers, which is in no one's interest.
There appears to be clashes all the time between ministers and civil servants. And then, of course, that's called bullying, isn't it? We saw Dominic Raab accused of bullying when he was in the government. Are ministers frustrated by the pace of Whitehall? I mean, is it still the Rolls Royce we all think it was or should be?
I think there's always that question of whether it was or not a Rolls Royce kind of civil service. I think most civil servants would recognise if you have an organisation that's 500,000 big, nearly 200 different separate organisations involved in it, there's going to be good things and bad things, good people and kind of worst performers and all of that. And government is complex because there are lots of issues that people are looking to say, well, that's not working. Why is that the case? Is that a failure of policy? Is it the government's policy in the political direction? Or is it a failure of execution of that policy and the administrators who are doing it? And most of the time, it's probably a bit of both. And so that makes it quite difficult to get to the bottom of. Ministers feel that they're subject to 24/7 scrutiny. If things go wrong, inevitably, whether that's just kind of the nature of what happens because it's big and it's complex, or if there's been failings, and ministers feel that they're the ones that are really kind of being held to account. So you can understand why when things go wrong or things are difficult, there can be a bit of that kind of finger pointing. I think civil servants want good, robust ministers. This idea that a minister who's robust is bullying is not the case. There are very robust ministers out there, and there is in every government, who treat people with respect, but are really good at what they do. They know how to hold civil servants to account for what they're doing, which is not bullying, it's just doing their job.
Yeah, often they want to be told which way to go, and they'll go, won't they? They just want clarity from the ministers, officials, as I understand it. And if they're not clear what they want, that's when I think you can get tension occurring. What's your take on reforms plans that they're concerned about the 24% increase in civil service numbers since we left the European Union to March 2023, up to 500,000 officials, as you said there, ballooned since Brexit and COVID. Danny Kruger wants to cut it by 30%. He wants to shut down some central government offices. What's your position on this? That could be some job losses for your members.
I mean, it could, but ultimately, government can have a bigger or smaller civil service. That's they're elected government. They can decide the size they want.
Yeah.
What any political party's got to work out, and I think this is kind of where Reform are. It feels a little bit immature in terms of their approach to some of it, but we've seen that from some of the bigger parties as well. Is it's not about creating an artificial number and saying that's the right size of the civil service. It's about saying, what do you want to do in government? The people who are civil servants are delivering public services. You can have less of that. You can have more of that. Obviously, you can look at efficiencies and see how it's done. But ultimately, these are the big choices that you've got to make. If you look at the numbers that have increased over that period of time, the single biggest area is prisons. That's prison officers who are civil servants. That's the single biggest area where there's been an increase in the size of the civil service. And that's because the numbers were reduced under the coalition years when they were cutting back. But of course, we kept putting people in prison. And that's the kind of dilemmas government's got. You can say there are too many civil servants and there are too many prison officers. Stop sending people to prison. We left the European Union where 3/4 of the people who used to arrive in this country came from EU and were not subject to the same checks as everyone else. So suddenly you change that, you need more border staff. So political choices have consequences. And I think that's going to be the same for Reform or Labour or Conservatives. What I would urge them to do is to think about what they want to do and then work out what are the numbers they think that are needed. The types of people, the numbers of people, and where. Do they want them in London? Do they want them throughout the country? And that's how you kind of design and work out what size of civil service you want.
It's Danny Kruger who's doing the policy thinking for Reform UK, which has just got 5 MPs, but is way ahead in the polls at the moment. They say they don't come with a chainsaw or a wrecking ball. Are you reassured that when if they do win power, we don't know, election to happen, of course, would that be difficult for civil servants, or would they work with Reform as much as any other party?
Civil servant, has an obligation to serve the government of the day. there'll be many civil servants who are unhappy with the direction the Labour are doing on certain bits of policy, just like there are some who are unhappy with the Conservatives, and that'll be the case for the reform. And you've got a choice as a civil servant: serve the government today or leave the civil service. You're not there to block or do anything or have a say on it. That's your job, and most civil servants will recognise that. I think for reform, because they've never been in government, although they may end up with some people who have been, as a party they haven't, they've got to think about this. And I suspect by the time we get to the next election, that, they're already running a number of councils, and the reality of that, from what the kind of rhetoric as they went into it, from what it's like when they're actually running councils and having to deal with the harsh realities of the finances in local government, there'll probably be a bit of learning from them around that what you say, a little bit of this kind of, anti-woke blob stuff and all of that can be a little bit different from what the reality is when you're in and governing, you've got responsibilities. When you make those choices, things stop happening. And when things stop happening, ministers are accountable for them.
But civil servants will work with Nigel Farage and help deliver his programme. That will happen because that's what the civil service does.
That's what it does. And if a civil servant doesn't like that, is uncomfortable with it, which they're entitled to do, then they have to leave the civil service. That's what I would say though is they're talking about having essentially politically appointed civil servants.
Well,
and I would urge them to think about that, because what the civil service does and does well is it gives ministers the best evidence-based advice. It's under the Civil Service Code that their job is to give them impartial evidence-based advice, and then ministers make choices about that. When they appoint people who simply politically agree with them, they're not going to get that sort of challenge. And that's the sort of challenge that ministers need. At the end of the day, ministers are accountable for policy. So they can ignore that and say, that's all very interesting, but this is what I want you to do, and do that. And that happens all the time. But that impartial evidence-based advice from people who are employed because of what they know rather than what they believe, I think makes for better government.
Have you thought of meeting with Reform UK, with Danny Kruger, these guys, to discuss what they might try and do and how they can work with your members?
Yeah, I mean, we are a non-party political trade union because, of course, we represent an impartial civil service, and therefore we deal with all governments and political parties. And what we tend to do is we get closer to an election, we'll start to look at the policies and what government are doing and see how we can engage with them. We tend to attend the party conferences that we replace it with people at the Institute for Government to talk about some of these kind of key issues around how the civil service operates. We, as a union, have been around for over 100 years, and part of what we're about is good government. It's not just about defending our members. We believe quite strongly that a good, strong, impartial civil service is good for the country. Yeah. And so that we will try and persuade Reform of how, if they are going to form a government, they can listen to voices like ours, but others, around how you actually govern.
So you will speak to them at some point, but just towards the election, like you do with all parties, is the point.
Yeah, kind of stuff. We tend to try not to get into kind of the political sphere, but we deal with governments of all colours as well. That's the nature of what we do and who our members are doing, what they're doing as civil servants.
We're looking at the Home Office this week. There's been a report out from Nick Timothy, who was the former Chief of Staff to Theresa May when she was Home Secretary. He wrote a report about it. There's concerns about, we're told there are listening circles in working hours where social and political issues are discussed amongst civil servants. What's your take on that? I mean, other companies do it in privately, but it seems to be a reason to beat up the civil service on areas like DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion issues.
I think, big organisations find ways of trying to listen to their staff, motivate their staff. This kind of listen on circles ideas is one that's, many management consultancies and organisations will be doing versions of. I think one of the points that I was making last week when the kind of the report was released to the Times was, look, if actually, you think about the huge challenges we've got in the Home Office area, particularly around immigration, do we really think the reason for that is because there's been some listening circles for staff? The reality of it is, it's been the failure of policy over decades, a disconnect between what politicians have said and what the reality has been that they've been able to deliver on the ground. And that's the challenge they've got in the Home Office. Home Office is as they say, not fit for purpose, has been the kind of graveyard of ministers for many years. That's not because of listening circles, it's because it's some of the most difficult policy areas that government has to deal with, and the reality of how you affect the changes that the country wants in relation to illegal immigration are really complex and difficult. If it was simple, people will have come up with those solutions before. And so if you want to solve that, I think it's focusing on what makes good policy rather than a few anecdotes about listening circles with civil servants.
Well, what's your take on critics who say the civil service is biased against Brexit? It was often said to me by Conservatives fighting for what they saw was a different Brexit to what the government was doing back in the years after the referendum. Is it right? Is there a bias in favour of the status quo as it was before we left the European Union, or is the civil service now come round to the way of thinking that we are now out?
I think for the civil service, it's not about saying pro or anti. What their job is to advise ministers and say, you can have this or you can have that. The civil service was told not to prepare for Brexit, right?
Yeah.
Cameron instructed it not to prepare. So they're being instructed to give advice. And then once that referendum was the case, and Theresa May came in, they were advised of the different options around the consequences for how you exited the EU, and those were political choices. One of the things I remember saying at the time when people talked about this was that I think you don't understand civil servants if you think that they're going to be running away from Brexit. Civil servants, a lot of them have got choices. They're very bright people who come in, a lot of them at the most senior levels, or come in through the graduate development scheme. They love big, hard, tough policy choices. That's what they come in to do. That's what attracts them to take the low pay that is the civil service compared to the private sector and deal with the big thorny issues that the country's facing. They would, to some degree, relish the prospect of a big policy challenge, and that's what they were trying to do. The reasons why we've still got this hangover from Brexit, it's not about the civil service being pro or anti. It is about the poor policy choices that have been taken and all the difficult compromises and everything we went through politically in those few years before we exited the EU, which have now got consequences that we're having to deal with. So all of those kind of failures, of course, there could be good advice or bad advice, but at the end of the day, they come down to political choices. Civil servants will have advised, and ministers made choices, and then civil servants would have to have executed that.
There's a widespread sense at the moment that the instruments of the state are failing. We saw the Epping migrant, the sex attacker migrant, being released early by mistake by the Ministry of Justice last Friday. Do you sense that? Is it the civil servants' fault? Is it a lack of investment?
I think failing public services are for lots of reasons. I think it's difficult to take one example. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that when they privatised the escort arrangements in prisons and it was Group 4, that became a bit of a meme because Group 4 were losing so many prisoners. You can look at an individual incident and try and replicate that and say that's systematic of everything else. There are lots of bits of the public service that work well, and there are lots of bits that don't. But if you underinvest, we've been through austerity, which cut the numbers, not just in the civil service, but in local government quite significantly. We've reduced their spending on the NHS compared to the previous decade. There are consequences for all of those things. So the reasons why things don't work are usually pretty complicated. Some of it political, economic, and of course, some of it might be about the administration and the execution of those public services as well, which is why if you want to solve them, that my plea to politicians is, do not be attracted to the kind of simple rhetoric and solutions, because all you do is say to the public there are simple solutions here, and there are never simple solutions to complex public service policy.
Well, it's on that very point. Is it the case that the civil servants will face a heck of a challenge under reform if they bring in all their plans to reshape the state, to change it completely? The challenge to do that is on your members, isn't it? And they may be found wanting because some of those plans may not be fully thought through. There may be a bit of an idea, and then your members have to implement them. And if they can't, they'll be blamed.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But it was ever thus, it's always been the case that there's been that challenge. Obviously, the more radical the reform, the bigger the risks that come with it, and the consequences of that not going well. People often talk about the private sector and the public sector. The difference is when something doesn't go well in the private sector, if Sainsbury's get their just-in-time stock at £1 billion software system wrong, there are problems with their profits. There may be challenges around whether they've got all the products that they want in the supermarket. You get that wrong in the NHS, you get that wrong in prisons, you get that wrong in welfare. It has huge consequences for the public. So those things, that's why it's different in the public sector, and that's why ministers have to be more cautious, which is sometimes why it can cost a bit more, or be a bit slower, because actually you've got to try and make sure these things do not fail.
Because the cost is so great. But the concern is that heads don't often roll in the public sector, and they do roll in the private sector.
Well, I'm General Secretary of a trade union. We wouldn't be in business if heads didn't roll. If I talk to my team and what they're doing day in, day out, dealing with civil servants being challenged around poor performance or misconduct, that's what they do. I think there's this myth that civil servants or public servants are not held accountable. Every big organisation struggles to do good performance management, whether that's the private sector or the public sector. There's no different. But, this is what we do every single day. I don't have enough resource to cope with the number of civil servants who are our members who are being disciplined or being held to account for their poor performance. So that, again, that's the challenge. If you think there's a simple solution and you crack the whip and the civil servants who are poor performing will work better, you've got to deal with the reality. That's not the reason why things are not working well.
Okay. Look, Dave Penman from the FDA, thank you for joining us this week on Chopper's Political Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're living in a time of what feels like pretty significant social change, and it makes us question things that we've even taken for granted for decades. And one of those at the moment that people are wondering about is actually money. Is the money in your bank account safe? Should you be investing elsewhere? Are we looking at a potential global crash? What will it mean for your savings? Is there a way that you could be using your money that might be outside of government control even? Well, TallyMoney is potentially one solution. So I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by the CEO and founder of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. What is TallyMoney?
Well, at TallyMoney, you basically get gold you can spend. So we give people an individual account in their name, everyday account. They get a sort code, an account number. They use that account just like they would pounds from their bank, but it's milligrams of gold that we brand as Tally.
Okay. Why would you do that, though? What is the benefit to the customer instead of just having a normal pound sterling account?
Gold's performance against the pound is above 11% per annum over the last 25 years on average. But we still need money in our daily lives, and we have savings. We know that it's good common sense and prudent to save up for things, not just live in credit. Whether it's a holiday or a rainy day, your retirement planning, you need to have money in your life, basically, that you can rely on, that's dependable, that nobody meddles with, that nobody can weaponize against you, which is another element of government control when it's the government currency, which we could talk about another time. And it should be pretty simple and straightforward, and that's what we deliver at Tally. And really, we just want people to feel safe and happy with their money. There was a time when the bigger your bank balance, the more confident you felt. Now it's like, I need to do something with it. I can't leave it there. In Tally, you can.
Okay, brilliant. Cameron Parry from TallyMoney, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bev.
Dave Penman, thank you. Now, last week's Caerphilly by-election was interesting. The bookies thought there might be a breakthrough for Reform UK. That never happened. And why didn't it happen? It looks like supporters of other parties, Labour Party, even the Tories, backed the candidate for Plaid Cymru, and that stopped, of course, the Reform candidate from winning. They got their 12,000 votes, but they were well short, it seemed, in the final analysis. What does that mean for the May elections next year? Thousands of seats up for grabs in the councils in England, of course, and other seats entirely in the Welsh Senate and also in the Scottish Parliament. What's it mean for Reform UK? Have we reached peak reform? Is there a problem with the party that has one single leader, and is that holding it back from trying to push on and deliver on its poll lead? Well, with me to discuss that is James Frayne, a former senior Conservative strategist, well respected in Tory circles, who thinks that having a single leader like Nigel Farage and not really any shadow cabinet around him is holding that party back. James Frayne, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. Why didn't Reform UK win the Caerphilly by-election last week?
Well, This is a very difficult question to answer. I think we'll only know this in the course of the next few weeks when people start talking to local voters. I think there are a couple of things that popped out. The one that Reform must be worried about, and which has been coming up all the time from voters, is this idea of what I've talked about as key person risk, which is a term used in the commercial sector to denote, in this sense, a massive over-reliance on the founder of the party. So in business, people are very worried about investing in businesses which are overwhelmingly dominated by their original founder. The founder falls under a bus. Who is there to take over? You have the same problem with Reform, that if Nigel Farage went under that metaphorical bus, who is it that would take over? Nobody can answer that question. And Reform are not just a protest party anymore now. Reform are seen as a potential future government. And with that in mind, it's not credible just to have Nigel Farage as the top guy that everybody votes for anymore. People are now, as we get close to an election, voting for a prospective alternative government. So they need to broaden the load.
The party, I think, was around 7 points at the beginning of last year, around bubbling around that figure, 7 or 8 points, 9 points, 10 points under Richard Tice. And then, of course, we got rocket boosters when Nigel Farage came back from the brink, stood all those that he wouldn't stand in June last year. And then, of course, the party's professionalised and changed its structure in September last year. It's a very, very, very new party, really driven, isn't it, by the support for Nigel Farage, the way he connects with people in a way few other politicians do connect. So if you take him out of the equation and let's say Richard Tice takes over again, you could see Reform go back to where it was before, 12 points in the polls.
Farage is a phenomenon. We know that, and I think this is not been sufficiently appreciated. I think, which is that Farage was always a good performer. He was always good giving speeches. He was always good on TV, charismatic. He's actually got better over time. I think partly as he's been doing so much GB News and so much presenting, he's really mastered the art of TV in a way that no other politician in the UK has, and I don't think has done for quite a long time. So Farage, I think, deserves more credit for that than people give him.
Well, just on that, James, having been with him a lot the past 2 years on GB News, what he gets no credit for is the way he listens to people. When they debate him in his studio on his show, he's a very generous host. He doesn't lecture them or shout at them. He makes the point, is very thankful and moves on. And I think that is what his opponents completely miss. They don't watch his show. They don't see why he connects so well with people, I think.
He does connect very well. And I think if you compare him to somebody like Kemi, Farage just seems happy. You sort of think that if you met Farage, even if you ended up talking about some really difficult subjects, be that identity politics or immigration, you think that he would do it with good grace, that he might have a laugh. With someone like Kemi, there just seems to be a sort of anger from her whenever she's talking about some of these more difficult issues. Now, Kemi has other strengths, but Farage just seems like a decent guy that you could imagine having a drink with. And I think that partly explains why he has done so well. Yeah, absolutely.
That's also true. I mean, he is a nice guy. He's a good guy to have a drink with, because we have had a drink with him many times and he is quite entertaining. That's what makes him so difficult for the left to try and understand. They're not sure where to place him, how to deal with him. And when he says things like ECHR withdrawal, when he talks about small boat migrants when no one else was, when he talks about the Epping hotels and the hotels, he does kind of lead the way of where the politics is going. And that's what makes him such a problem, I think. You were said in your piece, The Telegraph, this week, that why is it this obviously this Englishman, this campaigning zeal, he has got 27 points in the polls and is doing well in Wales and Scotland. I was there at the Hamilton Larkhall, the Stonehouse by-election. He nearly beat Labour. He was 1,500 votes short of beating Labour with no leader in Scotland. And let's not forget, no leader in Wales. I mean, how is he doing this?
Well, I think one of the irritating things for Farage and Reform at the moment must be that you've got idiots like me coming on and sort of saying, well, they really could have won Caerphilly. I mean, reality check, the fact that they were even in the mix is a phenomenal achievement from Farage and from Reform. And the fact that they're surging in Scotland says a lot about him as well. I suppose we need to look at the wider fundamentals in which Farage is campaigning in at the moment, which is that the main parties are unbelievably weak. I mean, you've been in politics for a similar amount of time than I have. And I can't recall a time when the parties have been as weak as they have. The Conservatives are polling at about 17 according to polls this week. Labour now dropped to about the same.
17,
I mean, this is,
Greens on 16,
Yeah.
Lib Dems 15. You've got the four parties, three main ones plus the Greens, within 2 points of each other, and 10 points ahead is Reform UK.
Yeah, we are in absolutely extraordinary times. And why is that? Well, it's because none of the main parties, so neither Labour nor the Tories nor the Lib Dems, have managed to articulate answers to the big questions. Above all, how are you going to deal with border control? But also, how are you going to deal with the surging cost of living? How are you going to deal with the NHS? And I think voters have just got so tired of these endless promises that they're going to sort everything out as soon as they come in, and nothing seems to change.
I'm not entirely sure Reform have got good answers on any of those issues. That they've got vibes, ambitions. They kind of, as you say, Farage cheers people up. Those who like him, they cheers them up. But I'm not sure their answers are any better. But I think people just think, well, they're all the same. Let's go with the guy who you might be fun to have a drink with. I mean, at this
point, absolutely. I think we are at the moment. I mean, people are asking about whether or not we're at peak reform. You might answer that question by saying, well, they might be at peak protest reform, in the sense of, as you suggested, people are thinking, well, I'm not going to vote for the Tories, not going to vote for Labour. I'm just going to say I'm going to vote for reform because, you know what, let's just drop a bomb in the system. As we approach the next election, though, people are going to start asking the question, do I want Nigel Farage? I mean, if we're in the US, they will be saying, do I want Nigel Farage in control of the nuclear button? That's their big test of whether or not someone is serious for government. In the UK, we might more reasonably ask, do we trust this person with the NHS? Or at the moment, do we trust this person with the economy, with public finances, and with runaway inflation? The next election is not going to solely be about border control. It's not a border control referendum. It is going to be about which government you want in control of all of these other things. People will be voting on, as I said, NHS. They'll be voting on surging prices, all of these things. And at that point, people are going to be taking the measure of reform on the basis of whether or not they're a competent, reasonable alternative government. Reform have got a very long way to go to prove that they can be that alternative.
That's exactly right. And I say this to some of the team around him. I say, you do need to have a shadow Home Secretary. You need a shadow Chancellor. You need a shadow health secretary just to talk about the health service, to talk about taxation, to talk about law and order. And they haven't got one. And they've got Nigel Farage as leader. They've got a deputy in Richard Tice who appears to lead on the economy, although we're not sure on that. You've got Lee Anderson, who is the chief whip, and two others who have no roles. I think this goes back to your central point. This issue of key person risk, it's being sustained by Nigel Farage, so he can bring people across. He's got Danny Kruger's come in, of course, as a switcher to develop policy. But if you were a senior disaffected Conservative now, you wouldn't really want to go across to Reform because there's no job for you. I mean, when we move jobs, you go there from the prospect of a better chance of being promoted or a better chance of having more to do. Where is the offer in Reform UK? And I think until Nigel Farage lets go of some of the power and the influence and accepts others into his tent, as it were, you'll have the same problem for a few more years.
Well, this is one of the big worries, isn't it? That he has never really accepted what you might call peers. I don't mean in the nature of the House of Lords. I mean people that are of similar stature to him that can challenge him. He's never had that either on the parliamentary side or on the politician side, if you like, but he's never really had this in the back room either. The Reform feels like mostly, not exclusively, but mostly a group of people who just couldn't hack it at the Tories or one of the other big parties. Now, again, that might be unfair, but that is the perception. And this is a particular problem for Reform because Farage is dangling some extraordinary constitutional changes in front of voters at the moment. They haven't clocked that. No. But when he is talking about the prospect of introducing an American-style political system, where essentially you've got ministers coming in from the complete outside that are unelected, we are in completely different waters than we've ever sailed in before. And as people start looking at that, they are going to be thinking, well, who the hell is it that is going to be running the health service?
But let's spell it out, James. What you mean by that is he might bring in someone who he likes from education, maybe an academy boss, into being education secretary. Now, normally the politics I've known for 20 years, as you have, that education secretary in the back of the day, it was Michael Gove when you worked with him. He would then be forced to appear in front of MPs once every 8 weeks and answer questions for an hour. That is how our democracy works. That wouldn't happen if someone came in who ran an academy chain. That person may appear in front of a select committee. So he wants to do it differently. But I think that the level of change he's doing, he hasn't got any peers. He has no peers in the House of Lords. So if he wins the election in 2029, he'll have a manifesto which has to be extremely clear on what he wants, because the Salisbury Convention will force the peers to follow him. But he needs to find some public spirited peers who aren't reform peers, but will just deliver his manifesto because that's what the people want. I mean, he's asking a lot, isn't he, of the system before he even begins to blow it up.
Absolutely. So, as you say, the convention in Britain is that if it's in the manifesto, the House of Lords will grumpily nod it through because they say that, well, the people have voted on it. We don't know necessarily that that's going to happen next time. We are miles away from reform articulating what this alternative government looks like. And as you suggested, I worked for Michael Gove in the past at education. The accountability that he was held to was very, very clear. We don't know what a Farage system looks like. He has hinted, like the American system, that a education secretary, for example, might be accountable to a select committee, but blimey, who the hell knows? But again, the worry is that the people around reform just haven't been that great so far. He is going to need to dangle in front of us the prospect of the former head of the British Army, or someone like Mervyn King that used to be governor of the Bank of England, that's a famous Eurosceptic. We're going to need people of that quality in order to feel that we are going to put our trust in these guys next time round.
And the central point, going back to what you say here, is the Prime Minister is called primus inter pares, which in English, in Latin term, English means first among equals. If you accept you're the first among equals, where you are, then you have to be that person. And as Nigel Farage turned that switch in his brain to admit, yes, it's been the Farage show for the past 30 years, but to be Prime Minister, it's a team game.
Yeah, and look, we don't know, you probably have a better sense of than I do. I don't know what happened with the likes of Douglas Carswell, with Patrick O'Flynn, with these sorts of people, Rupert Lowe, of course, that came in and had quite a high profile for a short period of time. For some reason, then fell out with Nigel Farage, and then all left in acrimonious circumstances. If we were in Russia, maybe there would be a different prospect to what happened to all of them. But he falls out with people, and then they move on. This can't keep happening. It can't, as you suggest, keep looking like the Nigel Farage show. It has got to look like he is, as you said, a first amongst equals, and it just doesn't at the moment.
You say the first amongst sequels or equals. I like, if that's a joke, it's quite funny. But
I thought I said equals. I may be funnier than I expected.
But of course, as we sit, I mean, the team around him say, "Well, Chopper, why do we need to do anything? Because the elections next May and in the local election, 10,000 seats up for grabs. You really need a strong leader. He's that person. In Wales, the D'Hondt system means that there's simply a pile of votes equals a number of members of the Welsh Senate. And you don't need it. He hasn't got a leader in Wales as things stand. He hasn't got one in Scotland either. There's a list system there, as well as one which links MSPs to seats. So we can really get away with this uncertainty, which actually helps him, can't he, for a few more months, maybe a year or two, before he has to try and actually demonstrate a top team to us.
I think he has a bit of time. There's no question about that. But time is running out, and all we need to do is look at the struggles that Starmer has got at the moment with the Labour Party. It's not inconceivable that at some point Starmer pulls a lever in government and literally nothing happens, that he has just lost control of the system anymore. In that world, for example, if there was I don't think this is imminent or anything, but if the IMF came out very, very strongly against the British government, all of a sudden our debt problems that are already big look even bigger, then you could imagine that we might head to an early election, because the government can't do the massive things it needs to do without another mandate from the public. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but my point being is we might not be that far away from a general election, and therefore time is ticking for him to sort this out more seriously.
By his own admission, Nigel Farage said to us in September he wants all of his candidates selected by the end of 2026 ahead of a possible snap election in 2027 because of what you're describing there. That he also thought there might be 70 or so left-wing MPs cleave away to join the Jeremy Corbyn party, or that could be the Greens now, because I think Jeremy Corbyn hasn't got started yet, but the Greens are doing quite well in the polls. That can all happen. It's very, very, I mean, we all thought it was getting boring, didn't we, James, politics back in July last year? It's not, is it?
No, it was boring for a very long time. I think a lot of us, still hanker after that level of boredom to some extent, because every time you wake up, there's some terrible new catastrophes has happened. I think, as I said before, I'm always loath to be one of those people, sort of clever outsiders that just attacks everybody for everything that goes wrong. Reform have done a phenomenal job, and Nigel Farage is a genuinely first-rate politician.
He is.
But reality check again, the British population have often had flirtations with, if you like, with third parties, with new groups, SDP, even the Lib Dems to some extent. There was that surge that Nick Clegg had back in 2010 that looked like, he might even be forming a government. Now, obviously that's not credible in hindsight. But my point is, the British people's commitment to the mainstream parties has historically been extremely strong. And by that, I mean, yes, they'll vote. I mean, a number of people even voted for the BNP in the late 2000s and early 2010s. We had that weird flirtation. But when it finally came to it, when people were told these people might be in control of your health service, in charge of the economy, the British have always gone back to established parties. Now, I do think we're in a different world at the minute. I do think reform is an entirely different prospect, even to the Lib Dems in 2010. But again, if I was in Nigel Farage's shoes, I would be extremely worried that when it comes to it, people are going to go home to those one of two parties.
And that's what happened in Caerphilly. On the streets of Caerphilly last Friday, I spoke to some voters there. It just felt these Labour voters couldn't give the seat to Reform after a century. It had to go back to another party who wasn't Reform. It was a too big a jump to make, and it's giving voters the confidence to make that step is probably the biggest challenge, as you say.
Which raises another point, which is, do you have left-wing voters, either soft left and hard left, coalescing around the most likely left-wing parties to beat Reform in a given election? Do you have, I suppose, really what's happening in France, happening in the UK, where you have a sort of, we'll do anything to stop Reform? You might even have left-wing people voting for the Conservative Party again to keep Reform out. Seems less likely given the way the Tories are going.
Is that happening now? Is there talk of that kind of progressive alliance against? Is that being talked about by strategists in the Labour and Tories? Anyone but Farage?
I don't think so at this point in time. But what we all know, anyone that watches politics closely knows that the British public, particularly on the left, have become much more, let's call it, politically sophisticated. By that I mean they really starting to understand tactical voting for the first time. The left is way ahead of the right on this whole area. And therefore, as we approach the next election, you can imagine tactical voting becoming a genuinely serious prospect for the first time.
Well, James Frayne, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you breaking into your half-term break to join us this week on Chopper's Political Podcast. Thank you. Thank you, James, and thank you also to Dave Penman earlier. I tweeted Christopher Hope on X or email me, chopper@gbnews.uk. Let me know what you think of this podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please do tell your friends. If you really enjoyed it, leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you find it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That helps other people to find it. Thanks to the great team of colleagues at GB News behind the podcast, Mick Booker and Jeff Marsh back at HQ, and the podcast busy worker bees, the Queen Bee herself, Rebecca Nunes, and the drone, George McMillan. And most importantly of all, thank you for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, and they do catch me during the week on GB News with your latest political updates and stories, and I occasionally do present shows, so watch out for me there. And also our best reporting online, gbnews.com. But until next time, cheerio!